Hello there. My name is Timothy Hampton. I'm the director of the Doreen B. Townsend Center for the Humanities at the University of California at Berkeley. Welcome to today's Berkeley Book Chat. The Berkeley Book Chats feature a member of Berkeley's arts and humanities community in conversation about a recently published piece of scholarship. Today, our guest is Jacob Gabory of the Department of Film and Media, discussing his new book, Image Objects, An Archaeology of Computer Graphics. Professor Gabory will be talking with Shane Denson of the Department of Art and Art History at Stanford University. It's a particular pleasure to see this work emerge in print, as Professor Gabory was a fellow in the Townsend Center 2 years and worked on it at that time. Now, before I turn the floor over to our guests, I'd like to make a couple of quick announcements, if I may. First off, this is our last book chat of the year. Despite the bleakness of the times, we've had a wonderful series of conversations across 2021, and none of them could have happened without the dedication and expertise of the staff of the Townsend Humanities Center and the educational technology staff on campus. So I'd like to speak for all of us in the arts and humanities community at Cal in expressing our appreciation to them. Second, I want to take a moment to whet your appetites with some news about next semester. We will, of course, continue, as always, our series of book chats. In addition, we'll be welcoming on April 27th and 28th, Professor Saidiya Hartman of Columbia University, who will be this year's Avenali Professor, and we'll be doing a series of events in the Townsend Center. On February 25th, a Friday afternoon, we will be welcoming Hollywood screenwriter and Cal alumna Nicole Yorkin for a workshop on screenwriting. I mention this now so that you can all get to work over the holiday polishing up your screenplays in time for her visit. And in March, we will be sponsoring a series of Wednesday afternoon events under the title In Dialogue with China, Art, Culture, and Politics. So please check our website for information about these events and others as well. Now, as we turn the floor over to our guests, let me remind you all that they will talk for about 45 minutes, after which we will open the conversation up to questions from the audience. So feel free to type your questions and comments in the chat as we go. Without further ado, it's my great pleasure to welcome Jacob and Shane to the Townsend Center.
Yeah, thanks for this introduction. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be in discussion today with Jacob Gabory about his recent book, Image Objects, which is really a beautiful image object in its own right. And it's a project that I'm especially happy to be talking about because I've been following this project for several years in the form of conference presentations, an invited talk at Stanford, occasional publications, bits and pieces here and there that I've picked up. And so it's really great to see it all come together as this solid object that you can actually, pick up and hold. And it's just out from MIT Press. And if you haven't had a chance to read it, I really recommend doing so. And I think we'll get into some of the reasons why you should. So first of all, I just want to start by commending you, Jacob, on the achievement that this book represents, which really goes far beyond, I think, the realm of computer graphics, which is what it is centrally about, but it has implications for contemporary culture much more generally. So just to give a kind of overview of a high level view of the way that I look at the book, I would say that Image Objects presents a remarkably coherent and yet multidimensional history of the computer's technical and conceptual reorganization from a kind of, calculating machine into a kind of all-encompassing lens or episteme or paradigm for humans' experience of the world today. And as you argued, this reorganization both revolves around and is expressed through computer graphics, including both mundane and spectacular screen images, but it also involves a transformation of the material objects that populate our environments. And it's really this ambiguity of computer graphics, their double existence as both images and objects, that marks not only a significant break with previous forms of visual media, but that ushers in computational media's sweeping transformation of the world we live in. So with a view towards unpacking this larger argument and fleshing it out a little bit, I was hoping we might start with the title concept itself. So what are image objects concretely, and how have they had such a profound impact on the world?
Great. Yeah, thank you so much, Shane, and thank you for agreeing to be in conversation with me today. Thank you as well to Tim and everyone at the Townsend Center. It's really wonderful to be back since I was, as Tim said, a fellow a couple of years ago, and I've loved all the work that the Townsend Center does on campus. Yeah, the title image objects, I think precisely as you've mentioned it, is I think both descriptive of the work that computer graphics does, but also a kind of provocation, both theoretical and methodological, about how we have to think about the role that computer graphics have in contemporary society. So for me, what interested me was getting out of some of the distinctions that we often think of when we talk about computer graphics, things like the real and the virtual, for example, and try and recognize that computer graphics sort of straddle both of these sort of forms and not privilege one over the other. The book is in some ways part of a kind of longstanding, I think, theoretical shift that's been happening in media studies for some time around a kind of material turn, a kind in digital media in particular, a recognition that computers aren't only sort of representational media that extend the sort of existing visual form of film and photography through things like special effects and the sort of cinematic or spectacular expression that you mentioned, and that I know that you've also written about in your own work. That they are also material practices grounded in a set of discrete technical objects. In the past, people have talked about this in the context of things like hardware and software and code. And often this work is quite dismissive of the role that the visual plays in computation, in part because we see visuality as an expression of precisely that immaterial and virtual quality that we associate with computation and digital media, particularly sort of post-1990s, post the end of the 20th century. And so I'm interested in thinking about the function and the role that digital images have in the sort of material condition of computation today. So image objects, as you mentioned, is both about saying images are material objects, particularly computational images, which are sort of made up of and made possible by a whole bunch of discrete technologies that have distinct histories that we can sort of study and analyze. I analyze and talk about 5 of them in the book, but I don't mean for that to be definitive in any way. In fact, I think that there are, dozens of other sort of technical practices that we could do a similar kind of materialist examination of in order to understand contemporary digital visual culture. And then the sort of inverse of that is also the case. Images are material objects, but also material objects in the world are in some ways images, in the sense that so much of our lived environment is actually the product of a kind of interaction with the history of computer graphics and computational images. This is most obvious, I think, in computer-aided design and architecture, where, of course, graphical software is used to build all kinds of things. But it's true of so much more than that. And I think my favorite example is the book itself, which you mentioned, and I've sort of played with this idea that this is an image object, but the history of desktop publishing, for example, the sort of technology that we all use to both write and print and circulate books today are in many ways really intimately tied to the history of graphics. And I talk about that explicitly in the book. So all kinds of things that we don't think of as computer images are, in a certain material sense, precisely that. So I'm interested in this kind of double valence, this sort of dialectical sort of play as a way of kind of saying maybe we should be thinking about computer images differently than we have over the past 20 or 30 years.
Cool, thanks a lot. I mean, it's really that kind of double valence and the interplay and complementarity between like the image and the materiality of images as objects, objects as images, that I think is really, really compelling about this book. And I kind of want to ask you to put or to extend that a little bit, and to help us understand a little bit about like the method or the theoretical framework within which you're thinking. And you might relate this to like one of the objects. I mean, I'm thinking of like your analysis, which is very, very compelling, about the GPU as both a kind of empirical device and a kind of media a priori, right? I mean, you don't use that term yourself, but you do subtitle your book An Archaeology of Computer Graphics. And I wanted to kind of think a little bit about the significance of this archaeological idea for you. I mean, obviously, there's a reference here to this branch of media theory that's especially pronounced in German-speaking contexts, but is increasingly present also in English language contexts, of media archaeology, which is associated with people like Friedrich Kittler, who I think somewhat unfairly is criticized as being a kind of technological determinist. But then on the other hand, you have people like Jussi Parikka, who's really emphasizing the way that media archaeology is all about contingency and the way that things could have been otherwise, right? And I feel like you're kind of in your bringing together of these valences of the image and the object, you're presenting a kind of version of these valences between, say, not quite determinism, but a structuring of the experiential world, and the contingency that is there and that has been there as a process of the unfolding of this historical process, I guess, right? So again, I just want to hear you say a little bit about what the archaeological idea as theory or method means to you.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Yeah, it's sort of strange as a media archaeological text in some ways. I mean, I think that certainly media archaeology was a big part of some of this sort of material turn that I've been sort of thinking with over the last 10 or 15 years, which is precisely, since this is my first book and it's a book that was based on dissertation research I did, of course, it's been in process for now over a decade. But one of the things that's a bit strange about calling it an archaeology, and a question that I get asked sometimes, is, archaeology, media archaeology is associated with the study of kind of like old and dead media, right? Things that, I mean, sort of classic, I think, in at least our shared discipline in film and media studies, the classic example is sort of destabilizing the history of the cinema by thinking about the way that the cinema emerges out of a sort of complicated milieu of the sort of transformation of vision, the work of Jonathan Crary and others in the late 19th and early 20th century, that it isn't sort of natural that the cinema just, of course, becomes the technology that we associate with so much of the 20th century, but in fact, there's a much more radical transformation that we can see if we sort of pivot to these long forgotten sort of toys and technologies. But computer graphics, in some ways, I'm arguing, are one of the most important technologies of our contemporary sort of lived environment and certainly media landscape. And so it is not old and it is not dead, though I guess one of the arguments of the book is that it is older than we think, right? That computer graphics emerged really at the start of the history of computing, and not in the 90s like many of us associate it with. But nonetheless, I think there's a kind of imperative that media archaeology gives us, a kind of anti-teleological framework for kind of rethinking the inevitability of maybe certain kinds of technologies. And that's certainly the sort of where I ground much of my methodological thinking. And this is something that, of course, I think all of us who try to be good historians try and push back against some of this, these sorts of frameworks of thinking about the inevitability of the present by finding excuses for it in the past. But this is particularly pronounced, I think, in the history of computing. Well, not to say scholars in the history of computing, but the way that we think about computation and computation's orientation, particularly toward futurity. there is this sense that there is a kind of almost utopian imaginary that we will sort of necessarily and inevitably arrive at, be it future promises or artificial intelligence today. But even the way we think back in the past is that, well, of course we are, succeeding at producing highly realistic computer graphics now, because that is the sort of necessary developmental bent that computer graphics has over time. And computer graphics, I think, is especially bad at this because we can see improvement happen in this very spectacular and visual way, right? Like certain characters, video games are maybe the best example of this. Lara Croft always gets sort of drawn out as an example of this blocky, 90s video game character who now looks super realistic. And it's not only about how we progressed over time, but about the idea that we are moving inevitably towards something like perfect simulation, that we will be able to one day actualize what Ivan Sutherland, who's considered by many to be sort of the father of computer graphics, what's called the sort of ultimate display, right? Total simulation, perfect simulation. And so this is an archaeology partly in the sense that it tries to surface the kind of sites at which these technologies get formalized and instantiated, and kind of built into the technology that we all kind of use without thinking today, right? All of us have a GPU, for example, in our computers that we're looking at right now. It's why I can see you on my computer right now in many ways, is that we're doing a particular kind of visual processing with that technology. But we don't necessarily think about those processes because they've been kind of naturalized and built in, or what I call in that chapter sort of crystallized, right? This sort of crystallization of a procedural logic that gets built into hardware that makes our computers work. And so the archaeological gesture that I'm interested in is sort of looking back to the moment in which those technologies are first developed, to ask what is the both historical and cultural context in which they were developed, and what kinds of decisions were built into these technologies that perhaps disclose other possible sort of routes they may have taken, which I think is partly in line with that archaeological gesture that you've sort of asked about. And I mean, the GPU chapter at the end is sort of this fun meta moment where the book is made up of all of these objects that I talk about, an algorithm, an interface, all these different kinds of technical objects and practices that then get sort of turned into this meta object, this chip that we all embed in our computers. And so I sort of say the history of computer graphics is a chip that we all sort of plug into our computers and execute, thousands and thousands of times per second in order to sort of make visual computing work. And so what I'm trying to do is sort of ask, how did those things get formalized in this way? And what does that tell us about both the history of computing and also the possible futures or future imaginaries that computing has for itself?
Yeah, that's great. And I think you do a really great job of kind of, balancing between these kinds of historical questions and contextualizations, and thinking about the ways that something like the GPU has a material impact right now on what is seeable and sayable, and really kind of going back to this Foucauldian idea of the historical a priori, which is really at the heart of this media archaeological impulse. But like I said, really bringing into play a kind of historicization that I think has fallen out of favor in some forms of media archaeology lately. Actually, I want to kind of shift gears though, and talk about kind of the politics that are foregrounded in this book, which is something that is happening all along the way in your telling of the ways that people interrelate and put things together, and these processes start emerging, and ultimately they kind of congeal into these devices and software forms, and ultimately into the meta object of the GPU and things like that, right? And it comes up in certain moments, like say at the end of chapter 3, which is devoted to the so-called Utah Teapot. You note the way that women play a largely kind of invisibilized role in the early history of computer graphics. So they're kind of there in the background constructing hardware components, or they're providing test objects, mostly for their husbands and boyfriends' kind of digitization efforts, right? So you mentioned like Marcia Sutherland's VW Beetle, that's what you start the book with and you return to it later. Sandra Newell's Melita Teapot, which is ultimately the model for the Utah Teapot. Or more extremely, I think, Sylvie Giraud's and Vicky Park's Faces, right? Which are submitted to the same objectifying analysis and processing as those inert objects that they brought to the table, so to speak, and literally, right? So these women's faces, I think they also, you don't comment so much on this in the book, but they stand in a stark contrast to another object that you talk about, which is Edwin Catmull's digitization and animation of his own hand, right? Which is an object that might be read as a kind of prosthetic extension of the man's agency, if not the hand of the kind of artist creator itself. And it's also a digital object in a self-reflexive way, right? But so given these gender dynamics, you know, thinking about the kind of everyday objects that the women are bringing to the table and then turning their own faces into objects with, you know, polygons marked on them, as opposed to this hand of the artist, you know, given these gender dynamics, would you say, or could you say, could an argument be made that image objects themselves are gendered? And are women in some way kind of the exemplary image objects, kind of alternating between spectacular visibility and inert objecthood?
I love this reading. This is super, I'm writing down some of this even as a way of thinking through, because this is, I mean, this is sort of a question that troubles the book in many ways. And it's one that I try and address, but also, of course, the book is sort of circles around maybe some of these questions at times, because the sort of archival figures of the project, and it is a primarily archival work, are almost entirely men. And you know, while there is a context for that, right, they are men working particularly in Salt Lake City. Many of them are Mormon men working on computer graphics in the 1960s and 70s, which I think is a sort of interesting context, both for that cultural framework and also for the way that we think about the role of women in that space. Nonetheless, I at times was frustrated at the challenge of sort of surfacing the sort of material labor of women in this history, and had to do so in a way at times that felt like addressing their absence rather than their presence, or their sort of the traces of their presence in the case of some of these images where they are literally traced on you know, a set of polygons on their faces. I sort of working maybe in reverse order. I do think that I love this idea of the sort of way that women get mobilized as kind of ideal image objects. And I do think that there's a larger history here. And I would flag the work of a colleague and scholar, Alana Staiti, who's now a curator at the Smithsonian, and who does work on the history of computing, and is a curator in the history of computing, who wrote a wonderful dissertation that I hope she's turning into a book on the history of models and modeling in computer graphics, because women are so often the sort of models that get sort of reproduced. I already mentioned Lara Croft, and it's a sort of ideal example, I think, of the way that women's sort of representations of women are sort of modeled and mobilized and sexualized, of course, in this sort of space, but who are often denied agency, or whose agency is negotiated in the case of someone like Lara Croft, for example. But at the same time, I think too, yeah, I mean, one of the interesting things, and I mentioned this is a big part of chapter 3, is that what's happening here in some ways is a kind of flattening, right? Where, I mean, one of the politics of the book is certainly about these sort of hidden labor and hidden contexts of these images and their production. But part of it is also about, if we understand the cultural context, then we can understand sort of like why certain objects are legible to these researchers as objects for simulation in the first place. So like why a teapot, And that has a great deal to do with the kind of cultural context in which they were working. I mean, especially in the teapots case, because the researcher was a kind of British emigre who working in this context. And the sort of story is that he was drinking tea, and that's why he chose this teapot. That said, what's interesting to me about the teapot is precisely that it is modeled and understood and sort of turned into a kind of mathematical provocation in precisely the same way that these faces and these hands are, right? That like all objects become equally legible to computer graphics because it flattens and decontextualizes them in this way. And that's, I think, part of why we can think of computer graphics as immaterial, is because they seem to be sort of equally applicable to whatever we want to make them sort of about or do, right? That is sort of their ontological function, is highly decontextualized in this way. But in sort of looking at, I mean, the modeling, I think, work, the sort of faces, as you said, are the most provocative in some ways, but the images that I'm most excited about from that chapter are the images of women doing the kind of manual labor of like soldering these hardware objects together in the 1970s, right? These sort of clean rooms full of women, exclusively women, kind of doing the material labor that makes the sort of myth, the sort of idea that these things are immaterial possible, right? The kind of physical labor required to produce this dream of immateriality is women's labor in particular. And so I think that's something that's only visible quite literally because of this kind of archaeological work to kind of surface and make clear that this doesn't come from nowhere, that it comes from a particular cultural context and a context that requires certain forms of labor that we don't necessarily recognize or think of as technical labor, and that these are not the people who are historically remembered in this particular program, which, you know, as you know, but is full of people who went on to found like billion-dollar companies, you know, and like the founder of Pixar, for example. Like we all know his name, but we don't know the names of, and I don't have the names of any of the women in those photos who were doing the actual work to build the chips that made that possible.
Yeah, thanks so much. Yeah, it's again this kind of story of this interdependency between the material and the spectacular, the image, and a flattening, as you say, of like images in or of objects, right? Of really of the forms that objects can take in the world. I have a kind of related question, I think, about race and racialization, right? So you include a color image among the plates, and I want to see if I can maybe show it. I'm not sure. I think you can kind of see it here. And it's so plate 5 in your book. It's an image titled Black Girl, right? And it's a computational painting from 1973 made by Fritz Fischer using the super paint system developed at Xerox PARC, right around the corner from my house. So you know, it's there, and it begs to be talked about, I feel like. And I just wanted to hear you tell us, if possible, what is the story behind this image, and what does it tell us more generally about the role of race in this history that, as you've mentioned, is really just dominated by white men.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a fascinating image, and I part of work that I would like to continue to do on this project is more work at PARC. The PARC's archives are a bit sort of sparse. There are a series of blue books that they produced, but a lot of it's not quite as thorough an archive, and they also are weird about letting people access that archive. But there's a sort of interesting anecdote about that image, and then a couple of them, one of them technical and one of them sort of contextual. But then I think there's also a larger conversation and question about simulation to be had. The specific context of that piece is that Dick Shao, who was the researcher who developed SuperPaint, which is, you know, for people who aren't familiar, kind of like the first Photoshop, we could think of it that way, right? A sort of pixel editing kind of paint program, like Microsoft Paint, for example, if people used that on their computers in the 90s and early 2000s. And they were developing this at Xerox in the 70s and it had this kind of presumed sort of collaborative function between artist researchers and sort of technologists. And so there were artists that were actually working at Park at the time, but Fritz Fischer was actually, I believe, I mean, this is, again, there's a lot of anecdote here, and I don't talk about it in part because I don't know, I couldn't find Fritz and I can't confirm this, but supposedly was a janitor who had a kind of artistic and creative flair and was sort of allowed access to these machines in order to produce some of this early work. This is some of the very first pictures. So the sort of other weird technical part of this is if you look at it, the image is kind of very streaky, and it's precisely because at that time the only paintbrush they had was 1 pixel wide and like, I don't remember the exact number of pixels, but like 10 pixels long. And so you could only kind of paint in this kind of weird, kind of streaky kind of way, which is why it has this sort of strange appearance. I don't know why he chose this particular image, and it's one of the few that survives in Dick Shaw's papers. Dick Shaw sadly passed away during the course of my writing this book, and I've been in touch with his widow, and also his archives are now at Carnegie Mellon, and he's an incredible person that I hope to, and I hope other people look at his papers now that they're going to be made available and try and write more about the work that he did at Park and elsewhere in the 80s and 90s. But this is one of the few images that he has of this sort of early moment. So it's interesting that this is the image that he sort of preserves. There's a sort of larger conversation that's happening now. I think that there's, certainly work on the sort of gender context of the history of computing broadly, work like the work of Mar Hicks and the work of Nathan Ensminger and others. And I gestured towards some of that here in the book. And there's now beginning to be some people who are working on this in the context of race, but much more in a contemporary context. So for example, researchers thinking about how the simulation of skin and the translucence of skin and subsurface light scattering and things like that have been sort of designed to privilege white skin and not darker skin tones or more melanated skin. And so thinking about how, in the way that this has been done in the history of photography already with, Kodak and other sort of film producers in the 20th century, how he sort of built in defaults for white skin and to privilege white skin in this way. And yeah, this image, I mean, in some ways is surprising for that reason. And I don't know precisely why he chose it, but I do think that, this sort of question of what is the context in this larger conversation is one that's really just beginning to happen now at SIGGRAPH and in the kind of science community itself. I think that work is really exciting.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And I think you're right. I mean, there's so much more work to be done about this. And if you just think about right now, right, the Google Pixel 6 is being marketed as something that corrects for imbalances of say white balance and whatnot, so that it can photograph dark skin alongside white skin. It's a really fascinating moment, I think. Well, I wanted to ask you about something else, which is not to remove us from this political domain, I don't think at all, but it may seem like it at first. So at one point you assert in the book, you say, quote, "Graphical objects are non-phenomenological," right? And you're alluding there, I think, to their excess beyond visuality or perceptibility, their existence as mathematical models or objects prior to their rendering. And I think that in some ways, both materially and conceptually, in emphasizing this non-phenomenological nature, your analysis comes quite close at certain points to my own theorization of what I call digital images discorrelation from kind of phenomenological subject-object relations. But I think for both of us, the non-phenomenological is not the end of the story, but really the beginning of it. And it opens onto transformations of the phenomenological realm itself, but transformations that haven't been able quite to be accounted for through a more traditional phenomenology, right? And I see this phenomenological dimension, right, pairing with this non-phenomenological notion of the image object. I see this phenomenological dimension coming to the fore in your work at certain moments when you shift kind of like intriguingly and abruptly at some times, but in such a powerful way, you shift like from a third person account of these archival materials and history to a first or even second person perspective. You ask the reader, for example, to focus on the physical book in their hand and to think about its material imbrication with digital imaging systems. Or at another moment, you recount your own recognition while you're watching a Silicon Graphics training video at the Computer History Museum, that you recognize that you're seated at a desk identical to the one on the video, and it's a relic of these histories of the computer graphics industry. Or you turn at the end of the book to the IKEA catalog or to a Billy bookcase. I mean, this isn't a Billy, but it's IKEA, right? And you ask us to focus on the interchangeability of object and image. And I feel like in these instances, you're inviting us into a kind of alternative kind of phenomenology, one that is, not assuming, say, the fixity of the subject and its relation to the object world, but that asks us to take a kind of oblique view of processes that cannot be kind of, concretized or captured, I guess, as either image or object, or as, subjective or objective. So I just like to hear you say a little bit more about like the role in this kind of alternative phenomenology, which you don't mark as such, but that I see kind of emerging here, about like the place of experience in this world that has been so modified and shifted by these kind of computational, topological transformations that you mark so kind of compellingly, especially when you get into the recursive dimensions of the way that, say, the GPU functions as a meta object. So that's a kind of broad invitation for you to think about the space of experience within this transformed world.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Thank you, Shane. And yeah, I do. I love the way that you sort of brought our two projects together, I think, and yeah, precisely in this way. In some ways, I mean, I think the idea that these things are non-phenomenal. I also in the introduction talk about that we have to train ourselves in new ways of looking at computational images, which maybe privileges looking as the way to experience them, but also I think is also about pushing back against the ways that we have trained ourselves to view and read images, certainly in our shared discipline in film studies, right, which is such a huge part, and it's such an important part, I think, of the kind of methodology that we deploy against at visual objects in visual analysis. But that because so much of a computational object isn't visible in its render, and that the render, and this is another argument in the book, is that the render is an interface in which computational objects are translated into legibility for us, but that translation, as all rendering does in the multiple ways that word can be made meaningful, kind of renders out a great deal of the kind of thick materiality of the thing itself. And in this case, all these objects that the book is structured around that are not necessarily visible in the images that we see. And of course, this is, in part about there's a bit of a straw man here, right? I don't think that we're all in a very naive or facile way, sort of trusting our phenomenal experience as sort of a ground or objective truth from which to work from. But nonetheless, I think I found when I started this project that I didn't have a language with which to describe the ways that computational objects sort of didn't match other images that I had been trained really to read and study in this way. And your work, I think, does this precisely in that way, and even in a way that I think is more tricky, because I don't talk about really much film or art at all in this book. But I think if we do look to the way that cinematic images have been sort of radically transformed over the last 20 or 30 years, I think that invisibility is even more of a problem precisely because there appears to be a kind of continuity between earlier forms of image making and sort of post-computational forms of image making that requires this sort of reorientation or this kind of shift. And for me, I think the site at which I often surface this, as you said, is sort of like in, you know, my own, I guess in this way, it is very phenomenological, my own sort of experience of objects in the world, which I begin to kind of see or perceive differently after having understood the ways that they are shaped by the history of computer graphics and by computational technology generally. And there are a lot of really I think I find when I talk to people or when people interview me about the book, the IKEA stuff is everyone's favorite. I think because we all have IKEA in our house, probably. There's a picture of a couch in the conclusion, which is that couch right there, which, you know, for anyone watching, the conclusion sort of talks about how most of the images in the IKEA catalog are digital renders and not actually physical things, which is maybe unsurprising, but I find it interesting how kind of like unspectacular these kinds of digital images are. And once you begin to know that, you begin to kind of see those things perhaps in a different way, because they are the things that are sort of surround us in this very like sort of informal kind of homely kind of way. There's also a wonderful sort of anecdote that we often hear. I work a lot in the history of architecture as well, and architectural historians and architects often talk about how you can like see this, what version of a software was used to make a particular building, right? And that's kind of the type of perception that I'm interested in kind of building or adding to, or hopefully enabling in some ways. I mean, that's a very expert way of looking at that, but being able to see the way that a building was constructed with computer graphics or with software, I think changes the way that we move through it, the way we experience it, the way we understand our own embodied relationship to it. But that's not something that we can do just by looking. We have to kind of learn to perceive differently. And I think that also opens up, you know, so much more of the world to sort of legibility in the context of this history, which is not to say that I mean, again, it's sort of, I think this is why our work is so wonderful sort of in conversation, is that I don't talk about this in a cinematic context, in part because I think we know that those are images already, even if we don't understand how they are different images than they once were. And so I instead focus on the sort of lived environment as the sort of site at which that intervention takes place.
Yeah, great. And, you know, I would just flag also for people who haven't yet picked up the book, you know, for a book that is really in large part about the infrastructures of our visual environments, it's also full of images, right? I mean, there's just so many images in this book, which again, I mean, you know, just look at this cover, which is itself beautiful. And it's got like 20 color plates, including this one, which, you know, you end actually on an artistic object by R.T. Vierkant, which I think is just really fascinating in this context. You know, finally at the end, we get an actual artistic object. I mean, that's not quite true, but, you know, one that is, that understands itself in that way, I guess. Yeah. So anyway, I just wanted to point that out, that the book is itself beautiful, and it is an image object in multiple ways, right? We've got a couple of questions from the chat, from viewers on our live stream. So one question is, let's see, the project you're describing seems to be, on the one hand, a technical account of how certain tools came to exist, and on the other hand, a social history. Could you talk about the challenges of writing this kind of history?
Yeah, absolutely. I feel very seen by that question because it was a challenge. I think in some ways the book has, it has sort of two goals. One of the challenges is that before writing this, there essentially were no histories of computer graphics yet written, which I don't want to like really like first, you know, I don't want to make a strong claim on that. And there have been a few books published sort of since that have more of a broad overview of the history of computer graphics. But when I began this project, I was really surprised to find that a lot of the history of this technology hadn't been written. And so some of this work was really in just trying to like understand in a very straightforward kind of way, like a sort of pre-theoretical way almost, you know, applying this method to a set of archives, again, primarily at the University of Utah, but also Stanford and the Computer History Museum and elsewhere, to try and piece together this relatively recent history. And in order to do that, I necessarily have to kind of think about the technical specificity of those objects. And so there's a lot of translation work that the book does as well to try and make legible technical practices for a humanities audience, not only just historians of computing, but I hope that the book is also interesting and legible to people who maybe have no real background in how computers work or the history of computing whatsoever. And so there is a lot of, you know, sort of technical work that's done there, but I also, as we've been talking about, really primarily been talking about, I think that there is an interesting kind of theoretical claim and a kind of transformation that's taking place that we can index sort of through the history of computer graphics. And I want people to be able to read the book sort of with that in mind at the same time. And so I found that as I put this book together over, again, the last decade, I really had these sort of two versions of it in my mind. And a lot of this book was funded through very generously through fellowships that I've received over the last decade. And they really were, you know, like German media theory fellowships, and then like history of computing, like the Association of Computing Machinery, like the you know, electrical engineering fellowships, things like that. So it is sort of a tightrope that I've tried to walk in the book. And, you know, I'm sure, I think the main critique that I get from the book sometimes is that it's very technical and people want more of me talking about like looking at a video in the Computer History Museum archives and that kind of work, which I do love and is really important. But I think it's important to think about and be able to read and understand sort of computer science objects through the lens of the humanities. And so I see a lot of the work that I'm doing as offering a kind of interface or a sort of site for the translation of technical practices into legibility with critical theory and with sort of some of these questions that we've been talking about, phenomenology, the sort of questions that I think are particularly capable of sort of working and thinking through in the humanities. So yeah, it's a challenge, but it is, I think, worth doing. And I see the project as well as like hopefully offering a kind of model for people who want to do this kind of work for other kinds of practices. Because as I said, I talk about 5 objects in this book, but I think that you could do this book in a different context about any number of other kind of technical practices that are also very important for the way that our world gets sort of built, constructed, understood through computation today.
Yeah, I think I mean, I personally, I found it was very successful in doing that kind of translational work. I mean, I enjoyed both sides when you're talking about watching the video at the Computer History Museum, but also when you're describing kind of the, you know, the technical nitty gritty of how these processes develop. So I think you make these things legible to kind of both sides of the aisle on that. Yeah, there's another question in the chat, which is early on, you were talking about contingency, and Shane, me, mentioned the importance of agency, of the agency of users. How does this changing history shape our own sense of our agency?
Yeah, I mean, I think I don't know if this is where the question is going, and someone should feel free, and although I know we'd have a bit of I think the questions are on YouTube and we're on Zoom, but I think part of that was part of the argument of the book is following in a kind of German media theoretical tradition, which, as you mentioned at the beginning, Shane is often seen as somewhat deterministic, a kind of media determinism or a technological determinism, a kind of strong argument for the way that media technologies shape what kinds of cultural expressions are made possible through them, which also comes from McLuhan and others. So, and I do see, I'm interested in this kind of method, but not in a way, of course, that is a kind of hard determinism where I'm saying that, we all are made to experience the world differently because of the history of this technology. But I think instead, what I'm interested in is saying that we've been trained or many of us have been trained in a set of methods for understanding and analyzing visual images that, while useful, are not sort of sufficient if we want to understand the way that computational images operate and structure, our world in various ways. And so we have to kind of sort of expand our understanding of computational images, and I try and model how that might work through the objects of the book. And this is to say that, there's maybe an opening of a new site of analysis, rather than just sort of like a recognition of the ways that we maybe do not have sort of control over, like sort of how the world is built or shaped by computer graphics. So it's much more about, like opening up new sites for critical analysis that maybe we didn't realize were there, because they aren't visible in quite the same way, or they seem to be visible in the way that a rendered image seems to be in a picture like any other, but is in fact a sort of cluster of technical objects that have to be understood in their technicity in this way. So yeah, I definitely have a kind of what I think of as a kind of German, but maybe just a media theoretical framework for thinking about technological determinism as important in a way that I think makes me sort of deprivilege some of the kind of cultural theory readings of visual images and representation. But what I'm really interested in is opening sort of new sites for critical analysis that maybe we haven't necessarily thought of as our objects in the humanities, objects from and sites within computer science in particular.
Cool. So actually, we have a question from Germany, from Florian Sprenger, who asks whether, so he says he's wondering if you ever thought about writing a chapter on the prehistory of virtuality or virtual reality.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because in some versions they're very much the same history, which is to say that SIGGRAPH, which is the big conference that happens for computer graphics every year. It's both an industry conference and a computer science conference. And I've spoken at it a couple of times, but I missed the 2018, I think it was, conference, which was the 50th anniversary of the invention of virtual reality. And all of the speakers are essentially the people that I talk about in this book, in part because virtual reality was first developed by Ivan Sutherland at Harvard in the late 1960s. And then he takes that technology to Utah and they continue to develop it there. And I think that there's a degree to which some of the conversation about computer graphics that happened not only at that time, but also in the 90s, that I'm both critiquing and kind of mobilizing in this way, is inseparable from the sort of hype cycle around virtual reality as well, right? When we think about what we thought computing would be in the 90s, a lot of what we talked about was virtual reality, but what we were in many ways talking about was visual simulation, was computer graphics as well. So I think in some ways they're very closely connected, and many of the figures are precisely the same figures. There are, of course, other kinds of image objects that we might need to examine if we're going to do that kind of work, even if maybe the sort of cultural imaginary, the kind of mythos around it is, I think, the same, right? All these pieces likewise go back to The Ultimate Display essay that Ivan Sutherland writes in 1965, which is essentially him proposing a holodeck, like a room into which we could enter, in which everything is perfectly simulated as it is in the real world. And he thinks of that as a display, interestingly enough, which is to say like a screen almost, which is very much what computer graphics is interested in. Now we think of that maybe as a space, and as a kind of separate concern or technology. But at the time, they're really one and the same in a lot of ways. And I know I want there to be more, and I think there is a great deal. I've advised several really wonderful dissertations in the last few years that are sort of doing media archaeological work on the history of virtual reality. And so I think that work is coming, and I hope that maybe this book does some work that people then don't have to reduplicate elsewhere in that area. And I think also like Jay Bolter and a few other people just published a book. There's a few people who've been publishing on that very recently. Though everyone is also deeply critical and concerned about the metaverse. So I think, we can take it with a grain of salt as well.
Right. Absolutely. So I wanted to ask you, I don't know if this is the final question. We're nearing the end, but I want to ask you about kind of in our context today. I hope this is not too predictable as like the last question or whatever, but thinking about our pandemic context, right? And you've mentioned that writing a book and getting it to the point of publication is a really long process. So I assume that most of the bulk of the work was done prior to the pandemic. And I'm just wondering if anything in your thinking about image objects as a book or as a topic has changed, due to this kind of environment that we live in now. I'm thinking about a couple of things. I'm thinking about in those early months, we saw all these computer generated images of the novel coronavirus on our screens. It's kind of an interesting image object, I think, which is itself bound up with all kinds of other imaging technologies, not just the rendering of that image. But I'm also thinking about the lived experience that we have every day now of interacting on Zoom and the kind of transformation of us as social subjects into something like image objects, right? So I'm just wondering generally, though, whether any of this, this past 2 years now, basically, has changed your thinking in any way or added any sort of new dimensions to your thinking about this topic.
Yeah, that's great. And it's funny, I haven't been asked that question before, and you're right that certainly in the sense that this took, a decade to write and oral and research and publish, much of it was done prior to that. But I think it literally was like, I think I certainly had submitted the book, and even maybe I think we locked down, and then I had like final revisions like a month later or something. So at that time I was just like in my house, trying to get this thing done, and like my tenure case was due around the same time. So it was sort of weird how it lined up basically being entirely pre-COVID. And I know many people have sort of added codas that maybe addressed some of this more explicitly because of the timing of theirs. I love the images of COVID. There are people who worked on this, and I'm blanking on her name now. I think she teaches at Yale. Scholars who've talked about the way that like medical imaging in particular, and the sort of using computer graphics to represent sort of microscopic worlds, right? Which again, thinking about, this is non-phenomenological, but almost maybe more an extension of sort of Benjamin's thinking about the close-up or the microscopic image or slow motion, right? Making the worlds we cannot perceive perceptible in this new way, but now it's being done largely through computer graphics. And I know people have also been doing work more recently about this in like the black hole imagery and things like that. I think if anything, the one thing I would say, since I know we're just about done, is maybe a warning, which is to say that I think the way that we've pivoted to thinking about the metaverse and the way that the metaverse as a kind of replacement for in-person interaction through computer graphics and through these kinds of simulations, much of the book is precisely about how computer graphics fails to simulate the complexity of the material world. And so I think this is a fantasy that we can reproduce the world in this way. And it's a dangerous fantasy, I think. And it's a sort of impoverished sense of what we mean when we say materiality. And so I would say a warning, if anything, about the virtualization of our sort of social world, and particularly in the context of the metaverse, I think is an impoverished sense of what we mean when we say the social, what we mean when we say the material, in multiple senses.
Yeah, I think it's an important warning, and I think the book bears it out in terms of the way that you're thinking about materiality. So we are at 1 o'clock. I just want to say thank you, Jacob. Thanks to everybody who came, and thanks to the Townsend Center for organizing this and involving me. It's been really a pleasure to talk to you today.
Yeah, thank you, Shane, and thank you to the Town Center as well. It was really wonderful to chat.